Hi everyone, welcome to today's ISE webinar. We're going to be talking through managing apprenticeships through the coronavirus crisis. We're going to explore the government guidance on COVID-19 and how it impacts learners, including those on furlough and are taking breaks in learning. James from BPP, as well as Cassie and Nikki, has got lots of interesting things to kind of run you through and hopefully help you and aid in kind of what you're doing as businesses. If you have any questions, they're happy to take them throughout the webinar. Please put your questions in the chat box so we can see them straight away. And without further ado, I will hand over to James and the team. James, welcome and please enjoy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. So apologies about if I do make any technical errors here with sharing screens and so on, but hopefully people will keep me right. So hi everyone. So my name's James Hammill. So I'm the strategic lead on apprenticeships at BPP, and we thought it'd be useful just to go through the impact that we're seeing from the employer side. So at BPP, in terms of apprenticeships, we work with over 1,000 employers. We have 8,000 apprentices. So we've seen quite a wide range of scenarios of what's played out in terms of COVID, of impacting employers and learners. So we're just going to go through what we're seeing is happening. It's an opportunity for you to ask any questions. So the chat panel is there. So at any point you want to ask a question about anything that we cover, please just put it in the chat panel and we'll stop and answer that question. So my background is training. I've been in training for almost 20 years now, apprenticeships probably for about 16 or 17. Started off as an accountant and ended up falling into training. We've got two other people from BPP as well, so both very experienced in apprenticeship. So Cassie and Nikki, do you want to introduce yourselves? So we'll start with Cassie.
Yeah, hi James, thanks for that. So I have been in training now for about 13 years and about 7 of those working in apprenticeships. So I have been involved in the accountancy trailblazers all the way through them from level 2 through to level 7, and have experience of working with employers across a range of different sectors in apprenticeships, including nursing, accountancy, management, banking, and more recently technology.
And I'm Nikki Williams, so I'm head of apprenticeship quality at BPP. Again, 13 years experience in education, predominantly from an FE background, but lots of FE providers I've worked in have had apprenticeship provision as well. And then a year ago moved into BPP, so I look after the quality of the apprenticeships across the group.
Okay, thanks Nikki. So hopefully I'm just going to move the screen. So these are the things that we're going to cover. So when you accepted the invite to attend this meeting, this is pretty much what we said we're going to cover. So I'm going to talk about broadly what we've seen in terms of how employers have responded to COVID in terms of impact on their students on programme. Nikki's going to cover what the government are doing. So that's looking at Department for Education, the Education Skills Funding Agencies, Ofsted and so on. And then Cassie's going to finish up with looking at, so what are the institutes, professional bodies, endpoint assessment organisations doing, and what organisations are doing to support learners, and a bit of advice if you do have students on programme. What we're seeing is good practice in the industry. So first of all, if I just cover this bit off, so hopefully you can see all of this slide. So part of my role is I look after some of the largest accounts at BPP. So we've got 30 large clients at BPP that make up a large proportion of our students. So part of my job is to support them to make sure that their programs are meeting expectations and so on. So I've got first-hand experience at what impact COVID has had on them and what changes they've made to their policy. So I've split this up into two groups really. You've got one which is employers that have learners on program today, and what impact has COVID had, what are they doing differently, and then what about their plans for new students, either new students in the coming months or new students in the autumn. So at the centre of all of this, obviously the first thing that employers have had to do is to put their delivery with their training partner online. So that's that little diagram in the middle of the person at the desk. So those training providers that have been delivering online predominantly for many years has been quite a smooth transition. So at BPP we had to move a a large number of our face-to-face teaching sessions online, but that was within the university and professional education, whereas apprenticeships on the whole were online anyway. Whereas I know that other providers have had to get up to speed pretty quickly. My wife is a lecturer at a university, and they were overnight taught to start teaching online. So obviously that's been a big move. But in terms of students on programme, what impact has it had? So I suppose they fall into two different groups. You've got one group of students that have, because of COVID, their workload has decreased significantly. So we've got certain sectors that we work with, so accountancy in particular, that they can't go out on audits, and the firms that they would go out on audit may well be shut right now. Therefore, their workload has decreased. So we have seen a significant number of students been furloughed. But the government guidance is that if you are furloughed, you can continue studying online. So that's had no impact on the students, and in fact, it's possibly helped that they haven't got the pressure of work to consider. Therefore, they can spend their time now on studying. So that is good news. But then on the other side, you've got other sectors where the workload for apprentices has actually gone through the roof. So it's either the demand on their types of businesses. So if we talk about banking in particular, banking has seen a huge increase in customer demand, wanting questions about loans or mortgages or so on. So in that group of students, we've seen two scenarios play out. One is where they've taken the break in learning as an option. So that is quite simply, you stop the programme. So you put a stop on the programme, you say, we'll look at it in a month's time to see whether we can get those learners back on programme. So that is one official route that you can go down. The second is a little bit more nuanced, which is you can look at the learning plan that the student is on to see whether you want to extend that programme. So maybe if they've got some deadlines coming up in the next 4 weeks, move those deadlines on, extend the programme by a month so they can focus more on their learning today, so that their work today, and they can do the learning, the more formal learning, later on in the programme. So there's nothing wrong with that, and we've got a large number of clients that have taken that as an option. And I suppose the reason for that is that when you put someone on an official break, that it is harder to get them started again. So they have to be highly motivated to then restart, whereas a rephasing, it's just a little bit softer. So it's encouraging them to, during this difficult time, to reflect on what are they learning about themselves and behaviours and dealing with difficult situations, and they can then use that in their portfolio later on. So that is one benefit of doing the rephase learning, and it just keeps them going. Then on to the other group of students that are ones that haven't started yet. So we've certainly seen, when it comes to bringing new people into business, that's definitely paused. So I'd say across the majority of our clients, if not all of them, those that did plan to recruit people in May, June, that's definitely been delayed. But we are still seeing that there is confidence in the autumn intake. So that your traditional school leaver or graduates coming into role, the numbers are staying relatively the same. So although a lot of clients are saying it's probably still too early to say, we are seeing on the whole that we're expecting the autumn numbers to be relatively similar to what we expected before COVID. But then you've got your final group, which is existing employees, so people that are already enrolled who were considering apprenticeships. We've definitely seen a bit of increased demand there. So this is, suppose it's going to be existing employees that have perhaps been furloughed, or existing employees that have got a little bit more time on their hands because of this. They've seen this as a great opportunity to get some additional learning in. So that's happened, and that's more with clients, employees that have done apprenticeships for a long time. They've always used it for existing employees. But certainly where it's an employer that's never done apprenticeships before and they were going to do it in May and June, that certainly stopped. And you can totally understand why, because starting up a new program for the first time, for those of you that have done it recently, there is a lot of learning to begin with at the beginning. So those have definitely said, well, actually, let's just take a break and we might come back and revisit it in September. So that's what we've seen in terms of the employer response, being incredibly flexible about moving provision to be online. They've been supportive of learners that have been furloughed to get them to continue studied. For those that don't want to take a break, they've been able to work with their training provider to rephase the learning. Still confident in autumn and using it as an opportunity to invest in training of existing employees as well. So I'm going to move on to the government response. So Nikki, I'm going to pass over to you and I'll move on the slide as well.
Thanks, James. So there's been quite a lot of talk, and obviously this is, the coronavirus impact has been very fast moving. There's been lots of different pieces of advice coming out, and it's, it can be a bit of a minefield to sift through all the information. So these are kind of really the headlines from the government response. So first of all, if we look at the education skills funding agencies, they are part of the government that are accountable for funding for education, particularly in training providers, colleges, academies, places like that. And what they have said, they have confirmed that if you do have employees that are furloughed, they can continue to study towards their apprenticeship. There are some minimum payment restrictions and rules that need to be met, but you can find the full advice on the government website. There's been no change in funding itself, but James nodded to this earlier. So breaks in learning, previously they could only be requested by the apprentice. So it might have been, they're pregnant, they're going on maternity leave, or it could have been a long-term illness, for example, and they would request the break in learning. In the current situation, and this is only a temporary measure, it can now be requested by the employer or the training provider as well. So if you do have, you need to move apprentices around and they're not going to be able to continue to develop their skills and behaviours in their job role, you can request a break. There's been a major change to the level 2 apprenticeships. So this was only announced, I believe, last week, but there's no longer a requirement to attempt the level 2 functional skills assessments if their EPA is due before the 31st of July. And this is so that it doesn't delay them actually achieving their apprenticeship if that's what they're waiting for. They do, however, require level 1 in functional skills. And there is no change to the requirements for level 3 and above. So this is just a slight change to the level 2 apprenticeships. They are also accepting email confirmations for necessary qualifications from the awarding organisation itself. Again, a lot of awarding organisations are not currently able to process certificates and get them out. And normally that's a requirement. We have to have the certificate before we can sign off at gateway point that the apprentice is ready for EPA. So they are accepting that. There's key piece of information that they need, but your training provider will be able to help you with that advice. So as far as support from the ESFA, there isn't, unfortunately, any financial support for levy-funded apprenticeships. There is some support for non-levy funded apprenticeships, but the closing date is in 2 days' time, and it is quite a hefty application. There are, 2 parts to it, but there's a lot of detail that's needed to be able to do that, but there is some support available for non-levy. And they've also extended the apprenticeship funding band consultation deadline, so it now closes on the 18th of May at midday. I will say if anybody is on here that is in a position where you could get involved with the consultation, please do. The biggest risk with this is that the proposals that they've put forward will mean significant financial reductions for many of the apprenticeship standards. So it will have a really big impact on the sector. And then we have the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. So they're really responsible for developing the apprenticeship standards and the assessment plans that go with them, monitoring the quality of the apprenticeship programs, and they also do recommend funding band changes as well to the DfE. So what have they said amongst COVID? So they are recommending remote assessments for EPAs wherever possible. There is a caveat to that. Anything or any change to an EPA and endpoint assessment has to be approved by whoever the external quality assurer is, and Cassie will touch on that a bit more in the next slide. There's also some changes, including simulated work projects. So some of the queries that we've had coming through at BPP are around, learners have planned a work-based project and they've been told now by the employer that unfortunately, because of the current situation, they're not going to be able to execute that. So there were concerns around how that was going to affect their endpoint assessment and them achieving their apprenticeship. So there has been some flexibility around that. And we can now use simulated work projects instead, so they can just slightly amend it and they can continue to achieve. And also last Friday, the apprenticeship standard adjustments and flexibilities were all published on the IFE website per standard, so they are on there. If you've got any sort of key concerns about a particular standard, just pop onto the IFA website, find the standard, and there's a big red box at the top of it, and it tells you if there's any adjustments or flexibilities during this time. And then we've got the Department for Education. So we have just seen something be published on there yesterday. We're still waiting for confirmation at the minute from the awarding organisations, but it's looking like functional skills for those that were due to sit up until this summer, it looks like they may be a calculated result, similar to GCSEs and A-levels. We are just waiting for official confirmation from the awarding organisations, but we have seen something about that, so expect calculated grades there. And also they're really encouraging distance learning, and as James said, for providers that already do a lot of online delivery like us, it's not been too much of a terrible transition. You know, it's been quite smooth. That can cause some issues for other training providers, but I'm sure all of them will be working hard to find a solution for that. And as far as Ofsted are concerned, at the minute, all inspections are paused. They are just following the government advice, and once the lockdown is lifted, then I'm sure they will notify people when inspection activity is going to continue. That doesn't mean all inspection activity is cancelled. So in some care settings, or if there are safeguarding issues, they will still go out and inspect there. But generally for training providers, as far as we're concerned, we're not expecting any inspections just yet, and we'll await further advice.
Okay, thanks very much, Nikki. So I'm going to touch on the response from the professional bodies and the EPAOs that we've been dealing with. Obviously, there are a huge number of standards and a very wide range of professional bodies and endpoint assessment organisations, and each one will have their own way that they've been responding to the crisis. But these are just some of the things that we've been discussing with the professional bodies and endpoint assessment organisations that we've been dealing with. And really the key themes that are coming out of our discussions with those organisations are the fact that as far as is practically possible, they do want to be flexible and adaptable. They want learners to continue progressing. They absolutely want them to be getting through that endpoint assessment. If they can expedite that in any way, then they will look to see how they can do that. So some of the key changes then that we've seen come through is, well, firstly, actually taking assessments. So the vast majority of apprenticeships that BPP deliver will have some form of professional qualification attached to them, and with that then they have to do some form of exam or assessment. Professional bodies have moved forward, in recent years. So I know, for example, SEMA, from an accountancy point of view, have put all of their exams online. So that move to doing online assessments maybe isn't, such an alien one for them. However, previously you would actually have to come into a testing centre to do that assessment, and I think that's been the biggest change really, is that whilst the software is there for them to do it online, suddenly you're not going to be able to bring all these learners together in a room. So several professional bodies have moved quite swiftly with that and have been really responsive and enabled learners to actually sit at home, do the assessment, and actually even be invigilated. So I think with SEMA it's like one invigilator for maybe 5 or 6 different people sitting in an exam. The rules do sound quite strict, so you literally, if you're doing the exam, you've got to sit there, you're not allowed out. And somebody's watching you, but at least that means you can take your exam and continue to progress. And actually, to Nikki's point, the ISFA now have supported over 60 standards to enable those assessments to move online. Again, many of the endpoint assessment organisations and the different standards will have a panel as part of the endpoint assessment, so where the learner has to come and do an interview or a professional discussion and will be questioned by a panel of experts. Often that will involve maybe an employer or an employee from a different organisation or an independent assessor. And again, in the current climate, convening a panel of up to 3 people might be quite tricky. So there are ways in which the panel composition could be looked at to maybe use different assessors or bypassing the panel requirement altogether. So that interview would only take place maybe with one independent assessor. I should really stress with this that, you know, these are just some of the examples that we've been seeing. You know, and to Nikki's point, all of these changes do have to be agreed by the external quality assurer for each of the standards. So what I'm saying here doesn't just mean, or if you've got a standard and it's got a panel, that means definitely that panel is going to, you know, not be needed anymore, and you're just going to be able to talk to an independent assessor. So it is really important that you do talk to your training provider or the endpoint assessor just to make sure for your standard, you know, what changes can actually be made. Linked into that as well then, so you will see a common theme coming through here. So where there's a professional discussion, you know, that has to take place in person, again, we could move to that being remote. One of the interesting ones then is, again, looking at the order in which you sit papers. So for some professional qualifications, there is quite a strict order. You know, the ISEW, for example, in terms of, you know, which exams you have to sit. And again, just to try to make things easier, some of that order can now be relaxed. Nikki's mentioned the projects already. So again, pretty impossible for many learners at the moment to actually go into the workplace to complete a project. And equally for some of the standards, so some of the digital ones, for example, to complete that project, it was almost like a residential where you had to go away for, you know, a few days and again be in an invigilated environment. And again, that's just not going to be practical at the moment. So there is flexibility in terms of allowing those projects to be completed at home. Portfolios are, you know, a very big component of many different apprenticeship standards. And again, often the rules are quite strict in terms of when that portfolio evidence needs to be collected. So often it's towards the end of the apprenticeship, or even once the learner has passed through that gateway stage, so is actually sort of ready to take endpoint assessment. And also the types of evidence that can be submitted as well. So looking for lots of examples that have been collected actually physically in the workplace. And again, I realise I'm saying again quite a lot here. You know, given the current climate, it might be just completely impractical to go into the workplace to get that type of evidence. So there may be some flexibility with regards to what evidence you can put forward. Maybe it's work from the beginning of when you started on the apprenticeship, and again, the types of evidence that could be submitted as well. So actually being able to use more, you know, reflective statement, written assessments rather than actual work-based evidence. Observations are a form of, you know, many apprenticeships, and you may be able to now do those in a simulated environment because you're not able to actually physically get into the workplace to be observed. And some endpoint assessment organisations as well, so recognising the fact that maybe learners are just going to have to cancel it at the last minute. Maybe they're ill, maybe it means, you know, to James's point, they've been working flat out in a banking environment, and therefore they're just not going to be able to do their endpoint assessment when they had planned it, and therefore have waived their cancellation fees. But again, that might not be the case with all endpoint assessments, so it is better to check with your training provider before taking that as read. One of the main ones we work with, DSW, and that is something that they've put in place to try and respond to this current crisis. So lots and lots of good news there, loads of examples of really great practice, the professional bodies, endpoint assessment organisations coming together, trying to keep the wheels in motion. However, it is important to stress that, you know, through no fault of some of the professional bodies or the endpoint assessment organisations, it's just not practical to move exams. You know, there was a sit-in at ISEW in June, for example, where everyone was, you know, going to have to come into an environment, and it's just not quick enough to be able to, you know, find an alternative for that. So those June exams have been cancelled and moved back to September. And again, the invigilation, there is quite a lot, as I'm sure you can appreciate, of resource and planning needed to actually be able to invigilate those online assessments if somebody is physically sat individually at home taking an exam. So not all professional bodies have been able to move maybe as quickly as others on that one, and therefore it might be the case that exams are needing to be cancelled. But if we move on to the next slide, we can look at maybe ways that we can keep on learning even if those exams aren't able to go ahead when we'd planned them. So James, you can move in to the next slide, please. Oh, James, can you hear me?
Yeah, it is the next slide as far as I can
sorry.
see.
That's me. I'm just focusing on it. Yeah, apologies.
Okay.
So yeah, supporting learners. There some top tips then. So as James introduced, there's some really good examples of great practice that we've been seeing, keeping learners engaged, keeping them motivated as we sort of move through these uncertain times. So my last point was mentioning the fact that some professional bodies have had to cancel exams. It's not the case that they're able to let them go ahead as they'd planned. And therefore it's important, if the learner wants to continue progressing, it's practical, and there's no reason for them to be on a break in learning, then working with your provider, we should be able to rephase those studies. So rather than concentrating on professional qualification, it might be the case that actually we can bring forward some of the skills and behaviours assignments that they might, be due to work on. So it's just, sort of clever planning, looking at that timetable and seeing how, we can move things around. Conversely, it might be the case that actually we've got a professional body that's been really ahead of the game. You can do those assessments, you're able to have them invigilated, and therefore it might be the case that, okay, well, you're not quite as busy at work, so we want to bring forward doing those assessments. Again, given that lots of the learning now, you can do it online, you can access all the tutorials, make use of the online resources, and therefore you're actually sort of front loading the professional qualification element. So really, it's very important to work with your training provider, keeping learners moving through and rephasing those studies in lots of different clever ways that can actually be individual to each learner, and again individual to you as an employer as well. It's been mentioned lots, but obviously we have made the point that furloughed learners absolutely can continue to learn. So it is a really, really great opportunity for them to get ahead in their apprenticeship. That is the case they're on the furlough scheme, but you do want them to continue working towards their apprenticeship. Something else then, which I always think is one of the best things about an apprenticeship in, my many years of working in this space, is the fact that apprenticeships can really help to stretch and challenge learners. And it's not just about being able to demonstrate what you can do now, it's being able to really think about what do you want to do, how can you progress, how can you get to that next level. And it might be the case then that this current climate actually enables you to really stretch and challenge your learners a lot more. So because you might not be in this sort of busy day-to-day work activities, you're at home, you might be doing more online meetings, and it might be practical for one of your apprentices maybe to join one of those meetings that maybe they wouldn't normally have been able to attend, maybe take the minutes, set the agenda. There might be projects that you could get maybe an apprentice to start looking at that, again, if you were in a normal working environment, it just wouldn't have been practical for them to be working on. So completely appreciate this is not practical for everybody, and actually it might be the case you're really busy, but it's just something that is worth looking at, how you can really get that stretch and challenge in during these times. Something else then that's worth considering is the use of free online resources. So BPP makes Pluralsight free for all of our digital apprentices anyway, but Pluralsight have actually opened themselves up for free for the month of April. So there's only a few days left to really make sure you get up to scratch on those PowerPoint skills, or Excel, or whatever it is you might want to learn about. Maybe they'll extend it, I don't know. I know as a homeschooling mum at the moment, I've been making a huge amount of use of Twinkle, which is my new favourite online resource tool. So lots of free online resources out there. And again, hot off the press today, actually, we noticed that Gavin Williamson has been working with the Open University and other online learning resources to make for free a huge range of skills activities online on things like coding, numeracy, IT, internet skills. You know, so there's plenty of stuff out there. It's almost overwhelming sometimes, the amount of stuff that you can access, to really make sure that, you know, if you are finding apprentices with not a huge amount to do, they can make use of these great online resources that are out there. And linked to that, then, you know, that obviously for many apprentices, working from home maybe isn't something that they've been particularly used to, and maybe they are starting to feel quite isolated. So, you know, lots of examples of great, you know, peer-to-peer learning sessions where you can get everybody in a group, sharing ideas, best practice, what they found useful on Pluralsight, you know, challenges that they've been able to overcome. You know, just to encourage them that peer learning and how they can really support each other. And it goes without saying then, you know, from a pastoral point of view, it is important to check in with, you know, the apprentices on a frequent basis. You know, because it's been so long ago that I've ever lived in a shared house, you sometimes forget that many, you know, young people might be living in less than desirable environment, you know, to actually be able to study. You know, maybe, you know, they're in a small room, there's, you know, there's not that much space for them. They might be living with others who maybe have lots and lots of downtime, you know, and are playing loud music, or, you know, actually, you know, they're just finding it a bit of a struggle. You know, even though they've got the time to study, it's just difficult for them. So really being understanding of that. Again, it might be that you have apprentices who are, you know, have families and are needing to sort of juggle work, study, and also being a homeschooler. You know, so being appreciative of that, and again, you know, trying to help them from a flexibility point of view in terms of, you know, thinking about a typical day and how they can juggle, you know, all these different competing priorities. And again, just being mindful of the fact that, you know, hopefully, you know, fingers crossed, with the infection rate coming down now, not as many people are getting ill, but, you know, given that we're in a time of, you know, this horrible virus, some people might get ill, and again, that might put a pause on their studies, and how we can really help them get through that, you know, helping them not to panic, and also really helping them to get back on track when they do feel better. So really, and I mentioned this before, but, you know, the top tip is make sure you're working closely with your provider. The best providers, I know BPP, you know, a really good example of this, have that tripartite relationship, which is front and centre of the programme. So, you know, the employer, the provider, usually via the skills coach, and then the apprentice, you know, working together, finding the best way through to really manage during these, you know, really difficult times. And that's that.
Well, thanks Cassie and Nikki. I need to put my camera back on. Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone. So I think we've came to the end of the presentation there now. So you can see there is a chat panel. So if anyone does have any questions, we can hang on. So if nothing comes through in the next minute or two, we'll just shut it down. Okay, well, I think we'll take that silence to be that you that there's no questions, I think. So thank you, Cassie. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks the ISE for arranging as well.
Thank you, everyone. James, have you got, so what we'll do is, the webinar is recorded. So for those who have attended, obviously, do tell your colleagues that they'll be able to log on to the ISE website, if they're an ISE member, of course, and download what you've seen today to pass on, because there's some really useful stuff in there, and it's quite a complicated thing, as we know. And then, James, do you have any contact details that you'd like to share, maybe if someone's got any questions or anything like that?
If I can put my email address, can I do that? Yeah, so if anyone wants just to have a quick chat, just let me know. There's my email address.
Is that coming up?
Was that not right? Hang on a minute, to everyone.
I don't think it's gone to everyone, James. Just
Oh yeah, if you go to entire audience, and then that should.
Don't have that. I've got send questions, staff, organisers, ISE events, organiser, panelists. Can you just put it on? It says just James Hammill at bpp.com.
Yeah, so I was going to say it's nice and easy actually. So it's James Hammill at bpp.com for those of you who don't want to ask questions publicly or virtually. Okay, so thank you to James, Nikki and Cassie, and we will see you. Hopefully we have a range of webinars over the next week and probably the upcoming weeks during the pandemic. So thank you to everyone and have a lovely rest of the week.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye.
thank you.
Bye.